Miss Hiller? The water's boiling. Hello! Ah!
Robin Williams died 12 years ago. Now his children confirm the rumors that the version of him the world saw in his final years was not the full story, and perhaps not even the most accurate one. Behind the public image of a tireless performer still appearing in films, television, and voice roles, there was a slow, invisible unraveling that even those closest to him could not clearly name at the time. The real reveal came only after his death in 2014. But to make sense of it all, we must start from the beginning. The medical mystery years and the big reveal after death. By 2009, Robin Williams had already survived multiple transformations. Television icon, improvisational force of cinema, Oscar-winning dramatic actor. But the final phase of his life was perhaps the most confusing of all. That year, he underwent major heart surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, an aortic valve replacement and mitral valve repair, a complex procedure that required significant recovery time and temporarily pulled him away from his relentless work rhythm. At the time, it appeared to be a contained health event. When he returned to acting, however, subtle changes began to surface. Colleagues on later sets observed symptoms that were difficult to categorize cleanly: tremors, sleep disruption, heightened anxiety, and occasional cognitive lapses that were unusual for someone known for verbal precision and rapid recall. These changes did not present as a single, coherent condition. Instead, they appeared fragmented, small disruptions that accumulated over time without an obvious explanation. Initially, the symptoms were interpreted through a familiar medical lens. Williams was at one point told he had Parkinson's disease, a diagnosis that seemed to account for tremors and motor changes. But as time passed, the progression did not match typical Parkinsonian patterns. The inconsistency created confusion not only for him, but for his medical team and family. Biographical accounts describe this phase as increasingly disorienting, not because of a single dramatic collapse, but because of the lack of clarity. Between 2009 and 2014, the decline continued in ways that were difficult to publicly define. Williams continued working in films such as Night at the Museum, Secret of the Tomb, and television projects, but those close to him noted that the effort required to maintain normal performance was increasing. What had once been spontaneous creativity began to require visible concentration. Reports from collaborators describe a man still professional and engaged, but operating under internal strain that was not fully understood at the time. But then, Robin Williams unalived himself at the age of 63 in his home in Paradise Cay, California, just north of San Francisco. The initial public narrative seemed straightforward. The beloved actor and comedian had been battling depression and had recently disclosed a Parkinson's diagnosis. Within hours, news of his death dominated headlines worldwide. Fans gathered outside his Hollywood Walk of Fame star, while colleagues from every generation of entertainment expressed shock. Director Steven Spielberg said he was a lightning storm of comic genius, while actor Steve Martin wrote that the world had lost one of the greatest natural talents in show business. President Barack Obama issued a statement noting that Williams had touched every element of the human spirit. To the public, the tragedy appeared to fit a familiar narrative. A brilliant entertainer had been overwhelmed by inner demons, or so it seemed. But almost immediately, pieces of the story failed to fit together. Family members, friends, and medical professionals were left with questions. In the months before his death, Williams had been experiencing severe anxiety, insomnia, confusion, memory lapses, digestive problems, and unexplained fear. He had difficulty performing tasks that had once been second nature. For a man whose career was built on rapid recall, improvisation, and mental agility, the changes were alarming. Yet doctors struggled to connect the symptoms into a single diagnosis. At the time of his death, Williams believed he had Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis had been given only months earlier, and even that conclusion was incomplete. While Parkinson's could explain some of the tremors and movement issues, it could not fully account for the extreme psychological and cognitive symptoms appearing alongside them. The final revelation came during the autopsy. Pathologists discovered extensive deposits of Lewy bodies throughout his brain. Lewy bodies are abnormal protein accumulations that interfere with communication between neurons and progressively damage multiple brain systems. The findings were so severe that experts later described Williams's case as one of the most extensive examples of diffuse Lewy body dementia they had encountered. Unlike Alzheimer's disease, which primarily affects memory, or Parkinson's disease, which primarily affects movement, Lewy body dementia can attack cognition, emotion, perception, sleep regulation, and motor control simultaneously. This transformed the understanding of his final years. Behaviors previously attributed to stress, aging, depression, or professional burnout suddenly appeared in a different light. The insomnia that left him unable to sleep, the escalating anxiety, the confusion, the emotional volatility, and the difficulty concentrating all aligned with known symptoms of Lewy body dementia. No one explained this more vividly than his widow, Susan Schneider Williams. In a widely cited essay published in the journal Neurology, she described the disease as the terrorist inside my husband's brain. She recounted how symptoms seemed to attack from every direction at once. One day, the problem appeared psychological, the next neurological, then cognitive, then physical. Doctors treated individual symptoms, but the underlying cause remained hidden. Looking back, she wrote that Robin was losing his mind, and he was aware of it. The diagnosis also helped explain observations made by colleagues during his final projects. While filming Night at the Museum: Secret of the Tomb in 2014, crew members noticed that Williams occasionally struggled with confidence in ways that seemed entirely out of character. He remained committed and professional, but there were moments when lines became harder to recall, and concentration required greater effort. At the time, these changes were often interpreted as exhaustion or stress. After the autopsy findings became public, those same moments were re-examined through an entirely different lens. His son, Zach Williams, later reflected on the family's struggle to understand what had happened. He explained that much of their understanding had to be reconstructed after the fact, once the diagnosis was known. In hindsight, many events that seemed disconnected suddenly became part of a coherent medical narrative. The family was no longer looking at isolated episodes of anxiety or depression, but at the effects of a progressive brain disease that had gone undetected. His daughter, Zelda Williams, has repeatedly challenged simplistic interpretations of her father's death. She has pushed back against narratives that reduce his final years to depression alone, or portray his death through a single explanatory lens. Her argument is not that depression was absent, but that focusing exclusively on it ignores the devastating neurological condition that was simultaneously reshaping his cognition, emotions, and perception of reality. Medical experts analyzing the case after 2014 have often pointed out that diffuse Lewy body dementia is frequently misdiagnosed, especially in early stages due to symptom overlap with Parkinson's disease, depression, and anxiety disorders. In Williams's case, this overlap contributed to a prolonged period of uncertainty. Neurologists and advocacy groups have since referenced Williams's experience to raise awareness about DLB, particularly its tendency to remain undetected until advanced stages or post-mortem examination. His case is now cited in medical literature and public education campaigns as an example of how complex neurodegenerative diseases can present in ways that defy early recognition. In the years following the death of Robin Williams, his story evolved from a heartbreaking celebrity loss into an important medical case that transformed public awareness of diffuse Lewy body dementia, DLB. Before 2014, The condition was far less recognized than Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, and even experienced physicians often struggled to diagnose it because its symptoms closely resembled multiple disorders at once. Everything changed after Williams's autopsy revealed extensive Lewy body pathology throughout his brain. Neurologists began pointing to his case as a powerful example of how the disease can remain hidden despite causing severe symptoms. Behaviors that had once been attributed to depression, stress, burnout, or aging were suddenly viewed through a neurological lens. His experience demonstrated that neurodegenerative diseases can affect far more than memory, disrupting perception, mood, sleep, movement, reasoning, and emotional regulation simultaneously. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, became one of the leading voices in raising awareness about the disease. Through interviews, medical conferences, and her influential writings, she helped explain what living with Lewy body dementia looked like long before a diagnosis was confirmed. Her insights gave researchers, caregivers, and families a clearer understanding of the challenges patients face. Meanwhile, Robin's children also contributed to broader conversations about mental health and brain disorders. Zach Williams has advocated for mental wellness and early intervention, while Zelda Williams has worked to combat misinformation and encourage more informed discussions about neurological illness. Since 2014, the medical community has made significant progress. Advances in brain imaging, biomarker research, and neurological assessments have improved the ability to identify conditions like DLB earlier, although diagnosis remains difficult. Specialists now emphasize that behavioral changes in dementia patients are often the result of physical brain damage rather than personal choice. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Robin Williams's final years is the importance of empathy. Modern dementia care focuses on patience, structured support, stable routines, and compassionate understanding. His legacy now extends beyond entertainment, helping improve awareness, research, and care for countless individuals facing neurological disease. The breakout that broke the rules. Born on July 21, 1951, in Chicago and raised in the affluent suburban landscape of Marin County, California, his initial life was far from perfect. His father, Robert Williams, was a senior executive at Ford Motor Company, frequently traveling for work, while his mother, Lori McLaurin, had a background in modeling. As a child, he spent long stretches alone in large homes. By his own later recollections and those collected in biographies like Dave Itzkoff's Robin, Williams developed a habit of creating entire imaginary worlds to fill the silence. Teachers and classmates remembered him not as disruptive in the conventional sense, but as someone whose imagination moved too quickly to contain. This pattern followed him into Claremont Men's College briefly, and then Juilliard School in New York, where he was one of only a handful of students ever admitted into the advanced acting program. At Juilliard, his instructors, including legendary acting teacher John Houseman, concluded that his talent was not in question, but his restraint was. Houseman would often say that Williams had no choice but to succeed. Fellow students described him as someone who could shift voices, accents, and physicality within seconds, often abandoning scripted material entirely. Even in controlled classroom environments, he was known to disrupt scenes. This would later become central to his identity. Then, in 1978, Williams appeared as Mork in a guest role on Happy Days. The character was originally intended as a one-off comedic episode, but audience response triggered an immediate reversal. The network spun the character into its own series, Mork and Mindy, which premiered the same year. What followed is one of the most unusual breakout trajectories in television history. A supporting character designed for a single appearance became a full cultural phenomenon within months. On set, the production quickly adapted to an actor who did not function within standard script boundaries. Writers frequently rewrote scenes after shooting began because Williams would generate entirely new dialogue during takes. Crew accounts from the period describe filming sessions repeatedly stopping due to uncontrolled improvisation that could shift tone, pacing, and even narrative direction mid-scene. Rather than disciplining this behavior, producers began structuring episodes around it. By the early 1980s, Mork and Mindy had turned Williams into a national figure. His stand-up appearances during this period, especially in San Francisco's comedy circuit, were described as kinetic events rather than structured sets. He would shift between characters, accents, and emotional registers so rapidly that audiences often could not distinguish between prepared material and spontaneous invention. The shift from controlled industry actor to unpredictable cultural force also created friction within production systems. Television at the time still operated under relatively rigid scripting and shooting structures, and Williams's improvisational dominance challenged those norms. Directors and writers had to constantly recalibrate scenes to accommodate his creative volatility. By the end of Mork and Mindy's run in 1982, Williams had already moved beyond television into film, but the foundational pattern had been set. He was no longer simply performing roles. He was reshaping them in real time. Rather than containing his style, Hollywood began building around it, allowing improvisation to become a commercially viable aesthetic rather than an anomaly. Fame, addiction, and the first collapse cycle. The transition from Mork and Mindy pulled Robin Williams into a decade where creative success and personal instability began to track alongside each other rather than separately. The first major inflection point came in 1982, when comedian John Belushi, one of Williams's close friends from the comedy circuit, died from an overdose of a controlled substance at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. Williams later described this moment as a rupture in his own behavior pattern. In interviews over the years, he acknowledged that Belushi's death forced him to confront his own usage of controlled substances, which had become embedded in parts of the 1980s Hollywood nightlife ecosystem. Unlike later phases of his life, this addiction was not hidden from public record. He openly discussed it in interviews after achieving sobriety, framing it as a cycle tied to fame acceleration rather than a single behavioral collapse. The structure of his work, rapid filming schedules, stand-up tours, and global promotional demands meant long stretches of high intensity followed by abrupt downtime. Despite this instability, the 1980s were also the period in which Williams delivered some of his most critically significant performances. In 1987, Good Morning, Vietnam marked a turning point. Filmed partly in Thailand, the role of radio DJ Adrian Cronauer allowed him to merge improvisational comedy with structured narrative film acting. Director Barry Levinson famously allowed him extensive improvisation in radio broadcast scenes, which created a hybrid performance style that blurred scripted dialogue with spontaneous creation. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. 2 years later, in 1989, Dead Poets Society further shifted his public identity. Filmed at St. Andrew's School in Delaware, Williams played English teacher John Keating, a role that leaned heavily on restrained emotional delivery rather than improvisational chaos. The film became a global success and reinforced a dual perception of him: uncontrolled comedic energy on one side, disciplined, dramatic actor on the other. Behind these performances, addiction cycles continued intermittently. While Williams achieved periods of sobriety during the late 1980s, biographies note relapses tied to stress, exhaustion, and the expanding demands of international fame. There were periods of stability followed by relapse, then recovery again. His children's later reflections provide context for how this period affected family life without reducing it to scandal. Zach Williams has described his father's life rhythm as one defined by extreme external engagement, where work and travel often dictated emotional availability at home. In public interviews, Zach has emphasized that his father's struggles were not simply personal failures, but part of a larger tension between public expectation and private reality. Industry colleagues from this era frequently described Williams as operating at an unusual intensity level, even off-camera. This was a period of expanding blockbuster cinema, rising celebrity culture, and increasing media scrutiny of personal lives. Substance use among performers was widespread, but often unspoken in official narratives. Williams's visibility meant that his behavior was both more documented and more mythologized than that of many of his peers. There was no single collapse. It was a repeating cycle. But then, he broke it. Reinvention through range. By the early 1990s, Robin Williams had already crossed every conventional boundary of screen performance, but instead of settling into a predictable star phase, he began a deliberate reshaping of what his career could contain. This was the decade when Williams gained the most creative control over his image, while simultaneously refusing to let that image stabilize into a single identity. The shift is visible almost immediately with 1991's The Fisher King, directed by Terry Gilliam. Filmed in New York City, the movie placed Williams in the role of Perry, a homeless former professor suffering from psychological trauma. The performance required restraint rather than improvisational explosion, yet still allowed controlled unpredictability. It earned him an Academy Award nomination and a Golden Globe win. A year later, in 1992, Williams entered a completely different creative system with Disney's Aladdin. The role of the genie became one of the most documented improvisational performances in modern animation history. According to production records and widely cited interviews with Disney animators, Williams recorded an estimated over 16 hours of improvised dialogue, much of which was not originally scripted. This forced Disney to redesign parts of its animation pipeline, as animators had to match visual sequences to unpredictable vocal material rather than fixed dialogue. The result was a structural shift in animation production itself. Instead of voice acting serving as a constraint on animation timing, Williams's performance inverted the process. Animation began adapting to voice spontaneity. Disney executives later acknowledged that the genie's final character design was heavily shaped by his improvisational rhythm, impersonations, and rapid tonal shifts. The momentum continued into 1993 with Mrs. Doubtfire, filmed primarily in San Francisco. Here, Williams again combined comedy with emotional stakes, playing a father who disguises himself as a nanny to stay close to his children after a divorce. The film became one of the highest-grossing movies of the year and reinforced his ability to operate in mainstream commercial cinema without losing improvisational unpredictability. Production accounts describe scenes frequently extending far beyond scripted structure due to his spontaneous comedic expansions, which were later edited into narrative coherence in post-production. By the mid-1990s, Williams was operating across two parallel identities: the improvisational comedic force and the controlled dramatic actor. This duality becomes most visible when compared with Good Will Hunting, filmed in Boston. In this film, he played Dr. Sean McGuire, a therapist guiding a young mathematical genius through trauma and emotional repression. Unlike his earlier roles, this performance was deliberately restrained, built on silence, timing, and emotional precision rather than improvisation. The performance earned Williams the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1998. Behind this visible reinvention, biographical accounts describe a performer increasingly aware of the limits of being defined by any single mode. Rather than resisting typecasting passively, Williams actively selected roles that prevented stabilization into one genre identity. His son, Zach Williams, later described his father's work ethic as deeply immersive, often shaped by total emotional investment in whatever project he was engaged in at the time. In interviews, Zach has emphasized that his father's presence was often defined by intensity rather than duration. He was fully engaged during creative work periods, then withdrawn between projects. Private life behind the public machine. Robin Williams's private life never followed the rhythm of his public persona. On screen, he moved at impossible speed, but at home, according to family accounts and biographical reconstructions, The pattern was less continuous, more fragmented, shaped by filming schedules, touring cycles, and long stretches of absence that came with global fame. Williams had 3 children from 2 marriages. Zach Williams was born in 1983 from his first marriage to Valerie Velarde, and Zelda and Cody were born in 1989 and 1991, respectively, from his second marriage to Marcia Garces. Each of them grew up during a different phase of his career arc. Biographical accounts consistently note that his work schedule rarely resembled a standard domestic routine, with long international shoots, promotional tours, and voice work sessions stretching across different time zones. Zach Williams has been the most publicly vocal about the structure of his father's presence during childhood. In interviews conducted after Robin's death, Zach described him as deeply affectionate, but not always consistently present, emphasizing that his attention often arrived in concentrated periods rather than continuous daily interaction. He has referred to his father's emotional engagement as something that came in bursts, a pattern shaped both by professional commitments and internal struggles that were not fully understood at the time. Zelda Williams has taken a different but complementary stance in public commentary, especially in response to media simplifications of her father's identity. She has emphasized repeatedly that he should not be reduced to a single archetype, either comedic genius or tragic figure. In one widely circulated statement, she described him as a person, not a caricature, a line that reflects a broader resistance to flattening his identity into public myth. Cody Williams, the youngest, has remained largely private, but family accounts and occasional references in interviews suggest a similar pattern of a father who was emotionally present when physically available, but frequently absent due to overlapping filming and travel schedules. Across all 3 children, the shared experience is not one of absence in emotional intent, but inconsistency in time and presence, driven by the structural demands of a high-intensity entertainment career. Biographers and colleagues often describe Williams's home life as operating in cycles that mirrored his professional rhythm. During active production periods, whether filming Mrs. Doubtfire in San Francisco, Good Will Hunting in Boston, or later projects, he would be deeply immersed in work for weeks or months at a time. Between projects, there were periods of relative quiet, though these were often shaped by recovery from exhaustion, travel fatigue, or personal reflection. This cyclical structure created a domestic environment that did not follow conventional stability patterns. His second marriage to Marcia Garces, who also worked as a producer on several of his films, also created an overlap between the professional and personal lives of the star. Their household was not separated from the film industry, but embedded within it, with children growing up in environments where production schedules, scripts, and film crews were part of everyday life. Despite the complexity of scheduling and emotional strain, accounts from family members consistently emphasize affection rather than detachment. Zach Williams has spoken about his father's humor and warmth within private settings. Even in private, he retained a tendency toward storytelling and character play. However, these moments existed alongside long absences. Zelda Williams has also highlighted the challenge of reconciling public perception with private memory, particularly as her father's image became globally iconic. She has pointed out that public narratives often assume accessibility based on familiarity with his films, while the reality within the family was more nuanced and less performative. Williams's private life was thus not marked by a singular dramatic rupture, but by structural imbalance. Fame did not simply intrude on domestic life, it reorganized it. The same qualities that defined his success, immersion, unpredictability, and emotional intensity, also shaped how he moved through family life, creating patterns of closeness and distance that shifted depending on work cycles and personal health. But the complications in his personal life were far from over. Addiction, relapse, and recovery cycles. By the time Robin Williams reached the late 1990s and early 2000s, his public image had already stabilized into that of a fully established Hollywood institution. But behind the continuity of awards, box office success, and voice roles, his personal history with addiction remained a recurring undercurrent. Williams's earliest documented struggles with substance use trace back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, when controlled substances and alcohol became embedded in parts of the Hollywood and stand-up comedy ecosystem. What distinguishes his later admissions is not the presence of addiction itself, but the way he openly linked his sobriety to external events. He frequently referenced the death of comedian John Belushi in 1982 as a turning point, describing it in interviews as a moment that forced him to reassess the trajectory of his behavior. That moment marked the beginning of a long period of sobriety that would define much of the late 1980s and 1990s. However, this was not a permanent resolution. Williams experienced relapse cycles, particularly under conditions of prolonged stress or professional exhaustion. Unlike early career addiction patterns, these later episodes were not constant, but intermittent, appearing after long stretches of sobriety. This pattern is consistent with what medical literature describes as episodic substance use disorder, where relapse is often triggered by environmental or psychological pressure rather than continuous dependency. In the early 2000s, Williams returned to rehabilitation after years of sobriety. This period is frequently cited in biographies as a reminder that addiction, in his case, did not disappear with fame stabilization. Instead, it reappeared in cycles even after decades of professional success. Unlike the earlier Hollywood addiction culture of the 1980s, this later phase occurred when Williams was already an established actor with significant control over his career choices, which complicates simplistic narratives of fame-driven excess. Industry colleagues and biographers often describe his working style during this time as intense but disciplined, with periods of extreme productivity followed by withdrawal. Films such as 1 Hour Photo and Insomnia reflect this darker tonal shift in his acting choices, moving away from improvisational comedy into psychologically restrained, often unsettling roles. While there is no direct causal link between role selection and addiction cycles, biographers frequently note that this era of his work aligned with a broader emotional seriousness in his career. His children's public reflections on this aspect of his life have generally avoided sensational framing, focusing instead on emotional and structural patterns rather than clinical labels or episodic detail. Zach Williams has spoken in interviews about the importance of understanding his father's struggles in the context of stress, identity, and internal pressure. In later mental health advocacy work, Zach has consistently highlighted the importance of early intervention and emotional awareness. Zelda Williams has similarly resisted reductive interpretations of her father's struggles, particularly in response to public commentary after his death. Biographers like Dave Itzkoff, who authored the most comprehensive account of Williams's life, describe his addiction history as part of a larger pattern of intensity rather than collapse. In this framing, substance use does not function as the central narrative, but as one component within a life characterized by extreme emotional and professional output. One consistent element in these cycles is timing. Relapses tend to occur after extended periods of high-intensity professional engagement. Williams's career rarely paused. Between film roles, voice acting, stand-up appearances, and television projects, he maintained a schedule that left limited structural downtime. Biographers note that this lack of sustained pause is significant in understanding how stress and exhaustion accumulated over time. But what if there was another explanation for all of this? What if his constantly changing behavior pointed to something else entirely? Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.